The station master didn't look up from his logbook when he said it. That was the part Naomi Bennett would remember longest. Not the words themselves, but the fact that he couldn't even be bothered to look at her face when he delivered them. Harlan Cross is dead, ma'am. Buried 3 weeks ago. Fever took him fast. He licked his thumb and turned a page. You'll want to make arrangements to go back east. Next eastbound coach comes through Thursday. Naomi stood at that counter with Eli on her hip and her one suitcase at her feet, 2,011 miles from anything she had ever called home, and she thought, Thursday. As if she had somewhere to go back to. As if the $12 folded inside her left boot were enough to get her there. As if the man who had written her letters full of promises, a good house, a strong herd, a name for your boy, had left anything behind except a fresh grave and a woman he'd never met standing in the middle of a Colorado street with nowhere to turn. She didn't cry. She wanted to. But Eli was watching her face the way infants do, reading her like a map, and she refused to let the first thing he learned about the world be that his mother fell apart in a train depot. She picked up her suitcase and walked out into the light. If you have ever watched someone you love make a choice that frightened you because you could see exactly how it would end, subscribe to this channel right now and stay with me to the end of this story. We release new stories every week, and I promise you will not want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Naomi. The town of Colton, Colorado was not the kind of place that softened itself for strangers. It had been carved out of high-altitude rock and stubborn ambition by men who arrived in the 1860s chasing silver and mostly found disappointment instead. What remained after the mines thinned out was a grid of unpainted buildings, a single muddy main street, and a population that had learned early that generosity was a luxury frontier life couldn't afford. By 1875, Colton had a saloon, a dry goods store, a livery, a post office, a church no one attended regularly, and about 400 residents who regarded newcomers with a suspicion bordering on hostility. Naomi walked the full length of that main street twice before she understood the problem. She had a baby, no husband, no local family, and she was wearing the same traveling dress she'd had on for 6 days straight because changing on a stagecoach with an 8-month-old was a feat she had not yet mastered. The women she passed looked at Eli first, then at her left hand, then at her face. The sequence told her everything about how they'd already decided to read her story. She pushed through the door of the dry goods store, not because she could afford to buy anything, but because it was the only business on the street that didn't have batwing saloon doors and the sound of men drinking at 10 in the morning. A small bell announced her arrival. A stout woman behind the counter, Mrs. Aldrich, according to the painted sign above the shelf, looked up with the practiced smile of a merchant, then let it fall when she registered the baby and the suitcase. Help you? The tone had changed by the second word. 2 syllables, and Naomi could already hear the verdict in them. I'm looking for work, Naomi said. She kept her voice level. She was very good at that. Any kind. Sewing, cleaning, keeping books, if anyone needs it. I can read and write. I'm good with numbers. Mrs. Aldrich's eyes moved to Eli again. Whose child is that? Mine. And the father? Naomi had prepared for this. She had rehearsed it on the stagecoach somewhere between the Kansas border and the first mountain pass. He passed, she would say. Last year. We were living in Ohio. Clean, true enough, and short enough that it left no room for follow-up questions. What she had not prepared for was Mrs. Aldrich already knowing the answer before Naomi gave it. You're the mail-order bride, the woman said. Not a question, a conclusion. Harlan Cross's woman. News in a town like Colton moved faster than horses. Naomi had been standing in the depot less than 40 minutes. I arrived expecting to marry Mr. Cross, Naomi said carefully. I've since learned of his passing. I'm in need of employment. We don't have work for a woman in your situation. Mrs. Aldrich said it with the calm certainty of someone delivering weather information. Not in this town, not with a baby, and no husband and no connections. You do best to move on. Move on to where? The woman said nothing, which was, Naomi supposed, the most honest answer available. She picked up her suitcase, adjusted Eli on her hip. He was starting to fuss, which meant he was hungry, which meant she needed somewhere private, and she needed it in the next 10 minutes, or the entire street was going to hear about it. She walked back out into the sun. She found a narrow strip of shade between the post office and the barber shop and sat down on her suitcase and fed Eli there, turning slightly toward the wall, trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. It didn't work. 3 women walked by in the space of 15 minutes. All 3 looked. None of them stopped. A man in a vest and a string tie came out of the barber shop, saw her, and went back inside without saying a word. It was the postmaster who told her about the boarding house. He came out to hang a new notice board and spotted her still sitting between the buildings, Eli now asleep against her shoulder. "Mrs. Delaney takes in boarders," he said, not unkindly. He pointed north up the street. "White fence, yellow door. She don't advertise it, but she'll take you for 2 bits a night if you've got it." "Thank you," Naomi said. "You got it?" She thought about the $12 in her boot. "For a few nights." He nodded. He started to go back inside, then stopped. Harlan Cross wasn't a bad man for what it's worth. The fever took him fast. I don't think he intended any of this. "No," Naomi agreed. "I expect he didn't." She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that Harlan Cross's intentions had very little relevance to her current position between a post office and a barber shop in a town that didn't want her. Mrs. Delaney's boarding house was clean and cold and smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and lye soap. The room Naomi was given had a single window, a narrow iron bed, a washstand, and a hook on the back of the door. The floor was bare wood. The mattress was thin. It was the best room Naomi had slept in for a week and a half, and she was genuinely grateful for it. She put Eli down in the center of the bed, surrounded him with the folded blanket from her suitcase so he couldn't roll, and then sat on the edge of the mattress and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since the station master had delivered his news. $12.30. 2 bits a night was $2.50 per week. She had roughly 5 weeks before she was completely out of money. Eli was 8 months old and still nursing, which helped, but he was starting to eat solids and would need more soon. She needed to find work within the week to have any buffer at all. She had a list of skills that would have served her perfectly well in Cincinnati or Columbus. She could sew a straight seam, keep a household ledger, teach basic reading and arithmetic to children, copy correspondence in a clean hand. Not one of those things was going to help her in Colton, Colorado, which appeared to have no school, no professional offices, and a social structure that had already decided what kind of woman she was before she'd finished crossing the street. She had one other option, and she had been not thinking about it since the stagecoach left Kansas. She could write another letter. The frontier marriage bureaus didn't care much about a woman's history as long as she was healthy and willing to work. There were men out here, ranchers, miners, homesteaders, who needed wives badly enough that they didn't ask questions. A widow with a nursing infant was a harder sell than a single woman, but it wasn't impossible. She'd done it once. She could do it again. The thought made her feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with her stomach. Because the first time she had been 22 and desperate after her husband Thomas died of a mill accident and left her with a newborn and a landlord who gave her 30 days. She had written to Harlan Cross with a carefully worded letter that described her practical skills and her willingness to work, and never quite mentioned Eli by name, only as a young child who is no trouble at all. Harlan had written back that he didn't mind. His letters had been kind. She had let herself believe them. She was not sure she had enough belief left for a second round. The next morning, she asked Mrs. Delaney directly if there was any work available in or around Colton for a woman in her situation. Mrs. Delaney was a practical woman in her 50s who had been widowed twice and had long since stopped having opinions about how other people chose to survive. She poured Naomi a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute Naomi had been drinking for 2 weeks, and thought about it seriously. "The Hendersons need a laundress," she said finally. "They've got 6 boys and a sick wife, and they're drowning in washing. They won't pay much, $1 a week maybe." "That's fine. They'll also want to know who you are, and they'll make up their own answer before you finish telling them. You should know that going in." "I know. There's also—" Mrs. Delaney paused, refilled her own cup. "There's a rancher about 4 miles east, Holloway, Wade Holloway. He runs cattle, keeps mostly to himself. His regular housekeeper took sick and moved back to her daughters in Denver. He's been without help since February." "Would he hire a woman with an infant?" Mrs. Delaney looked at her steadily. "He might. Holloway's not like the men on this street. He doesn't talk much, and he's odd in his ways, but he's fair. He paid his housekeeper's passage to Denver out of his own pocket when she got sick. She picked up her coffee. That's all I know about him. Naomi wrote the Hendersons' laundry into her mental plan as immediate income. She filed Wade Holloway away as the second option, the one she'd pursue if the laundry money wasn't enough, which she already suspected it wouldn't be. The Henderson house was exactly what Mrs. Delaney had described, minus any of the softening details. 6 boys ranging from 3 to 14, a mountain of washing piled in the backyard that suggested it had not been touched in at minimum 2 weeks, and a husband named Carl Henderson who opened the door, looked at Naomi, looked at Eli, and said, "She'd tell you it's $1 a week?" She did. "That's all it is. That's fine. Baby can't be in the way." "He won't be. He sleeps mornings, and I can strap him to my back while I work." Carl Henderson looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man trying to find the catch. There wasn't one, which seemed to confuse him. He stepped aside and let her in. She worked 7 hours that first day. Eli slept in a basket she borrowed from Mrs. Delaney for the first 3 hours, then went on her back in the sling she'd fashioned from her spare shawl for the next 4. By the time she walked back to the boarding house at 5 in the afternoon, her shoulders were burning and her hands were raw from the lye soap, and she had gotten through less than half the accumulated washing. But she had worked. She had earned something. The coin Carl Henderson pressed into her hand at the end of the day was only 25 cents, a fraction of the weekly rate. But it was hers, and she had gotten it by doing something real. She told herself it was a start. She was trying very hard to believe that. It was on the 3rd day at the Hendersons that she first saw Wade Holloway. She saw him the way you see most things that matter in small towns, sideways, by accident, while you're doing something else entirely. She was carrying a basket of wet sheets across the Henderson yard toward the line when a rider came up the main road, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere he needed to be in the next 10 minutes. He was not what she would have pictured from Mrs. Delaney's description. She'd imagined odd in his ways to mean something visibly strange, some eccentricity of dress or manner that would be immediately apparent. But the man on the road looked like every other rancher she'd seen since arriving in Colorado, tall in the saddle, weathered, a hat pulled low against the April sun. He was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his early 30s, with a lean face and the kind of stillness that comes from spending a lot of time alone with only animals for company. He didn't look at her. He was watching something across the road, a group of men arguing outside the livery, and his expression as he watched them was unreadable in the way that some people's faces are always unreadable, not because they're hiding something, but because they simply don't announce themselves. She didn't know it was him yet. She learned it later from the Henderson boy, the 14-year-old, who came out to help her hang sheets and volunteered the information the way adolescent boys volunteer all information, as a kind of currency, something offered in exchange for the dignity of being talked to by an adult. "That's Holloway," the boy said, nodding toward the rider who was by then nearly past. "Comes into town once a week for supplies, mostly. Don't talk to nobody much." "Does he come to town alone?" "Always." The boy shrugged. "Ain't got nobody. Just him and the cattle and old Jasper, who works the herd with him." He paused. "My ma says he's sad. My pa says he's just particular." Naomi watched the rider until he disappeared around the curve of the road. "What do you think?" she asked the boy. He considered it with the seriousness of someone who had genuinely not been asked his opinion before. "I think," he said finally, "that sad and particular probably look the same from the outside." That night, after Eli was asleep and the boarding house had gone quiet, Naomi sat at the small table in her room with a sheet of paper and a pen she'd borrowed from Mrs. Delaney and wrote out her finances for the 3rd time in a week. The numbers had not improved with repetition, even if the Henderson job held, and she wasn't sure it would, because Carl Henderson had the look of a man who made decisions impulsively and changed them the same way. $1 a week wasn't going to stretch to cover room, board, and an infant's growing needs. She was already dipping into the $12, not deeply, but enough to see the trajectory clearly. By June, she would be out of money. By July, she would be... She didn't want to think about by July. She needed either more income or cheaper lodging or both. She folded the paper. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, listening to Eli breathe the slow, uncomplicated breathing of a baby who didn't yet know there was anything to worry about, Naomi made a decision she hadn't quite admitted she'd been building toward all week. Tomorrow she would ride out to the Holloway Ranch and ask for work. She had no horse, so she would walk 4 miles each way. She had a baby, so the walk would take longer than it should. She had no references or local reputation to recommend her, so she would have to make do with honesty, which was either her best asset or a serious liability depending on who was doing the listening. She would find out which one it was when she got there. The walk took her 2 hours. The road east out of Colton was rough and not reliably maintained, and the April morning had the sharp, unpredictable weather of high-altitude spring, cold in the shadows, too warm in the sun, and liable to shift without warning. She carried Eli in the sling on her chest, and her suitcase was back at the boarding house, so her hands were free, which helped with the footing on the rougher sections. She used the time to practice what she intended to say. I am a capable woman. I can cook, clean, keep accounts, and manage a household. I have an infant who will not be a burden on the work. I will do whatever is needed, and I will do it reliably, clean, factual. No appeal to sympathy, because in her experience, appeals to sympathy made men uncomfortable, and when men were uncomfortable, they said no faster. What she would not mention unless asked, Thomas. The mill accident. The reason she'd been desperate enough to answer a frontier marriage advertisement in the first place. Harlan Cross. Any of it. She was still rehearsing when she came around a bend in the road and saw the ranch. It was smaller than she'd imagined. A main house, a barn, a set of holding pens, a bunkhouse that looked like it probably slept 2 at most. But everything was in repair. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing that told her the most. The fences were mended, the barn doors were straight on their hinges, the wood on the house was weathered but solid. This was a ranch that was actively maintained by someone who paid attention. A man came out of the barn before she reached the gate. Not Holloway. This was an older man, 60s at least, with a white beard and a considerable squint. He looked at her the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see, which is to say, with a blankness that hasn't yet decided what it thinks. Help you? He said. I'm looking for Mr. Holloway. I understand he's in need of a housekeeper. The old man, Jasper, she guessed, based on the Henderson boy's description, looked at Eli, then back at her, then at Eli again. You the woman from the depot? He said. Word in Colton apparently traveled faster than she kept giving it credit for. Yes. Cross's... He stopped himself. You come about the housekeeper job. I did. He studied her for another moment, then jerked his head toward the house. He's inside. Go knock. She went and knocked. There was a long enough pause that she thought he might not be home after all, or might be choosing not to answer, which amounted to the same thing. She was adjusting her grip on Eli and deciding how long to wait before she admitted defeat and began the 2-hour walk back when the door opened. Wade Holloway in person was exactly as still as he'd appeared on the road, and approximately as talkative as his reputation suggested. He looked at her. He looked at the baby. He waited. My name is Naomi Bennett, she said. I was given to understand you need a housekeeper. I'm looking for work. I have an 8-month-old son who will not interfere with the job. I can cook, clean, manage accounts, and handle whatever else the household requires. He leaned in the doorframe with his arms crossed, not aggressive, just thoughtful, as though he were actually considering what she'd said rather than looking for the fastest way to end the conversation. You just arrived in town, he said. 3 days ago. On account of Harlan Cross. Yes. Another pause. He looked at Eli again, not with discomfort, she noticed, but with a kind of careful attention, the way you look at something you're trying to understand rather than something you want to dismiss. I pay $8 a month, he said. Room and board included. There's a small room off the kitchen. I'm out most of the day. Jasper eats here twice a day. That's generally it. Naomi did the math in under 3 seconds. $8 a month plus no rent and no food costs was transformative compared to what she currently had. That's acceptable, she said. I don't need company, he said. I don't need conversation. I need the house kept up and meals at reasonable hours. I understand. He looked at her steadily for one more moment. Then he stepped back from the door. When can you start? She had not expected it to be that simple. She'd prepared for negotiation, for conditions, for skepticism that would have to be talked through. The absence of all of it threw her slightly. "Monday?" she said. "I have obligations at the Henderson place through Saturday." He nodded. "Monday's fine." He started to close the door, then stopped. "The boy?" He seemed to be searching for the right word and not quite finding it. "He's young yet. I imagine he'll need things." "He will," Naomi said. "I'll manage it. He won't be in your way." Something moved across Holloway's face. Not quite an expression, more like the passing shadow of one. "I didn't say he would be," he said. He closed the door. She stood on the porch for a moment in the morning sun, Eli awake now and watching a crow that had landed on the fence post with the complete fascination that 8-month-olds bring to crows. She thought about what had just happened. She thought about the way he'd said, "I didn't say he would be." Not a correction, not a reassurance, just a statement of plain fact offered with the particular care of a man who was accustomed to being misread. Then she turned and began the walk back to Colton, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, the arithmetic in her head had a different answer at the end. She gave Carl Henderson her notice that afternoon. He took it badly, which surprised her less than it might have. Not because Carl was a bad man, but because he'd already been struggling to find a replacement, and he'd half convinced himself by now that Naomi was a permanent solution to a problem that had been defeating him for months. "Holloway's place?" he said. "What does he know about running a house?" "I expect I'll be the one running it," Naomi said. "He's a strange man, keeps to himself. Folks don't know much about him." "That hasn't been a disadvantage yet, from what I can tell." Henderson looked at her with the mild bafflement of a man who had expected gratitude and gotten clarity instead. "Suit yourself," he said finally. He paid her the remaining $3 of the week's wage. She'd been there 4.5 days, and she accepted the 3 without argument, because 3 was better than a disagreement about fractions. She told Mrs. Delaney that evening over supper. The older woman listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Naomi had come to appreciate about her. "Holloway," Mrs. Delaney said when she finished. "Yes. People will talk." "People are already talking. I'd rather give them something to talk about that includes me earning a living wage." Mrs. Delaney was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that stayed with Naomi for much longer than it should have, given that it was only 6 words. "He's a lonelier man than he lets on." Naomi looked at her. "Is that a warning?" "No," Mrs. Delaney said, and went back to her supper. "Just an observation." Mo. Sunday night, Naomi packed her suitcase in the narrow room with the bare wood floor and the hook on the door. Eli was already asleep, finished with the world for the day with the enviable completeness of the very young. She folded her dresses, wrapped her small collection of practical things, needle and thread, a folded piece of oilskin, the copy of David Copperfield that she'd been reading in 10-minute intervals for 4 months and had not yet reached the middle of, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. She thought about Thomas, briefly and without dwelling. He would have hated Colorado. He had been a city man in his bones, happiest in noise and crowds and the organized chaos of a Cincinnati street. The frontier would have baffled him. The silence would have driven him to distraction. She thought about Harlan Cross, whom she'd never met and never would, and the letters he'd written from a place he'd called the most beautiful country you've ever imagined. She thought about whether she could be angry at a dead man for failing to survive long enough to meet her, and concluded that she couldn't quite, though there was something that sat in the neighborhood of anger and might have been mistaken for it in bad light. Then she thought about a man who leaned in a doorframe and said, "I didn't say he would be in a tone that was neither kind nor unkind, but simply careful," and decided that careful was more than she'd had in a long time and might be worth something after all. She closed the suitcase. She blew out the lamp. Monday was coming, and she intended to be ready for it. She arrived at the Holloway Ranch on Monday morning with her suitcase in one hand and Eli on her hip, and the particular alertness of someone walking into a situation they understand is either going to save them or break them, and aren't yet sure which. Jasper was already in the yard when she came up the road. He watched her come through the gate without moving from where he stood, one boot propped on the lower fence rail, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. He gave Eli the same squinting assessment he'd given him the first time, as though the baby might have changed significantly in the intervening days. "Thought you might not come," he said. "I said I would." "Lots of people say things." He straightened off the fence and jerked his head toward the house. "Kitchen needs the most work. Wade don't cook. I mean, he can, but he don't. You'll see what I mean when you get in there. She got in there. She saw what he meant. The kitchen wasn't dirty exactly. It was the kitchen of a man who kept things functional, but had given up entirely on comfortable. There were dishes stacked with a kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested they were washed and put back in the same position every time without any consideration for arrangement. The table had one chair, which she found unexpectedly sad in a way she couldn't have explained. The shelves had provisions: flour, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, organized by what appeared to be frequency of use rather than any other system. There was a cast iron stove that was in good repair and a window over the wash basin that let in the morning light. She put her suitcase in the small room off the kitchen. It was barely larger than a generous closet, but it had a cot and a hook on the wall and a wooden crate that would serve as a shelf. And it was private, which mattered more than size. She laid Eli on the cot and surrounded him with the blanket and went back out to begin. She didn't see Wade Holloway until noon. He came in from the range with Jasper, both of them carrying the particular silence of men who have spent a morning working hard enough that words felt unnecessary. He hung his hat on the hook by the door. Naomi noticed there were 2 hooks and only one had ever been used, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the table. She put a plate in front of him. Salt pork and fried potatoes and biscuits she'd made from the flour on the shelf, because it was what the pantry had and she wasn't yet familiar enough with the supply situation to improvise beyond the obvious. He looked at the plate, then at her. "Thank you," he said, as though the words had to be located before they could be used. "I'll need to know what you have coming in regularly," she said, sitting down across from him with her own plate. She'd made enough for 3, Jasper having stationed himself at the far end of the table. "Supplies, I mean. Whether there's an arrangement with the dry goods store or whether you purchase as needed." "Purchase as needed," Wade said. "That's the more expensive way to do it." He looked at her with an expression she was already beginning to identify as his version of surprise, which was to say, almost no change in his face at all, only a slight adjustment in the quality of his attention. "Is it? If you have an arrangement with Aldrich's for monthly credit, you can buy in bulk and save roughly a third on staples: flour, beans, coffee, salt." She paused. "I could set that up if you want. I'll need to know what your monthly budget is." Wade put down his fork. Not in annoyance, just thinking. "How do you know that?" "My husband kept accounts for a textile business in Cincinnati. I kept them with him." She picked up her own fork. "I'm reasonably good with numbers." He didn't say anything for a moment. Jasper had stopped chewing to listen, which he appeared to do with complete shamelessness. Finally, Wade said, "I'll think about the arrangement." Of course. She had not expected him to agree on the first day. She hadn't even been sure why she'd brought it up so quickly. Something about the single chair at the table had made her want to demonstrate immediately and concretely that she was here to be useful in ways that weren't just biscuits. The town's reaction to the arrangement was both faster and uglier than Naomi had anticipated. By Wednesday, 3 days after she'd moved to the ranch, she came into Colton for supplies and encountered the verdict that had apparently been reached in her absence. It came from a woman named Ruth Garfield, who stopped her in front of the post office with the directness of someone who considered confrontation a form of civic duty. "People are talking," Ruth said, "about your arrangement at the Holloway place." "I imagine they are," Naomi said. "A widow woman, no husband, living out there with a single man." "As his employee," Naomi said. "As his housekeeper. The same job Mrs. Whoever it was had before she moved to Denver." "Mrs. Connolly was 63 years old," Ruth said. "That's a different matter entirely." Naomi shifted Eli on her hip. He had reached out and grabbed the strap of her bag and was engaged in trying to put it in his mouth with the total concentration of a baby who had found something fascinating. She gently redirected his hand. "I understand the concern," she said, because she'd found that acknowledging the thing directly was faster than arguing with it. "I don't have another option, Mrs. Garfield. I have a child, I have very little money, and a man has offered me a legitimate job at fair wages. I'm taking it." Ruth looked at Eli with the expression that Naomi had been seeing since the depot. That particular combination of sympathy for the child and judgment of the mother, as though Eli's circumstances were unfortunate through no fault of his own, while Naomi's were both her fault and somewhat suspicious. "People will make assumptions," Ruth said. "People already have," Naomi said pleasantly, and walked into the post office. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, her face hot, her jaw tight. Then she took a breath and let it go. She had 4 months of money maybe before this job became her only option in any meaningful sense. That was not the time to make an enemy of everyone in Colton simultaneously. What she needed to do was survive. The rest could sort itself out. The first real crisis came on the 3rd week, and it had nothing to do with the town's opinion of her. Eli got sick. Not desperately, not dangerously. A fever that climbed and held for 2 days, nothing she hadn't managed before, but the nearest doctor was in a town 40 miles south, and she was 4 miles from Colton, and the fever was 103 by the second afternoon. And her hands were not quite steady as she wrung out the cool cloth and replaced it on his forehead for the 7th time in an hour. She didn't hear Wade come in. She didn't hear anything except Eli's fussing and the sound of the clock in the main room and her own internal catalog of every symptom and whether any of them were worsening. She became aware of him in the doorway of the small room when Eli made a sound that wasn't quite crying. A thin, worn-out sound, the sound of a baby too tired and uncomfortable to properly cry anymore. And she made an involuntary noise in response, something too quiet to be a word. And when she looked up, Wade was standing in the door watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "Fever?" he said. 2 days. It's holding at 103. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Jasper's wife used to put a wet cloth on the back of the neck, said it helped bring it down faster than the forehead. The back of the neck. She hadn't known that. She wasn't sure if it was true or folk medicine, but she tried it immediately, repositioning the cloth. And Eli made a small sound that might have been relief or might have been coincidence. Wade said, "I can ride to Mrs. Delaney's. She might know what the doctor would give for it." Naomi looked at him. He was serious. "I was genuinely offering to ride 4 miles into town at," she glanced at the clock, "nearly 7 in the evening, to ask a boarding house owner for medical advice on behalf of a baby that had no claim on him whatsoever." "He'll be all right," she said. "Fevers like this usually break by the 3rd day." "Usually," Wade said. "Yes." He stood there for another moment. "I'll be in the main room," he said. "If it goes up, tell me." He said it the way he said most things, flatly, matter-of-factly, as if what he was offering was simply obvious and required no particular acknowledgement. He went back to the main room. Naomi sat with Eli and the cloth and the clock, and somewhere in that long, uncomfortable evening, she noticed that the tightness in her chest had loosened slightly. Not because the fever had broken, it hadn't, not yet, but because there was someone on the other side of the wall who had said, "Tell me," and meant it. The fever broke late the following afternoon. Eli fell into a deep, relieved sleep, and Naomi sat on the edge of the cot with her head in her hands for a while, and was not quite crying, but was also not quite not crying. Then she washed her face and went to make supper. Wade was at the table when she came out. He looked at her face, which she knew betrayed more than she wanted it to despite the washing. "Better?" he said. "Much." "He's sleeping." He nodded. He looked back down at what he was doing, which appeared to be mending a piece of harness. And then, quietly, without looking up, "You did all right." It was not much. It was possibly the minimum amount of acknowledgement one person could offer another. But Naomi, who had been running on the pure mechanical fuel of necessity for 3 weeks, with nothing externally confirming that she was managing at all, felt it land somewhere that had been waiting to receive it. "Thank you," she said. She meant it more than was immediately obvious. April became May, and the work settled into a shape. She learned the rhythm of the ranch the way you learn anything in a new place. First by the disruptions, then by the patterns that surrounded them. Wade and Jasper left before dawn most mornings, and came back somewhere between noon and 3, depending on what the herd needed. The cattle were a mix of breeds, about 80 head, which Jasper explained was a modest operation, but a profitable one because Wade managed it carefully rather than ambitiously. She learned that Wade ate whatever she made without comment, positive or negative, which after 2 weeks she decided to interpret as satisfaction because the alternative was too dispiriting to consider. She learned that Jasper, by contrast, had strong opinions about coffee, specifically that it needed to be strong enough to float a horseshoe, which she'd initially taken for hyperbole and revised upward after tasting Wade's previous attempt. She learned that Wade read at night. He had a shelf of books she hadn't noticed initially because they were behind the bedroom door. History, mostly. Some practical animal husbandry volumes, a collection of Shakespeare that looked so battered and well-handled it must have been traveling with him for years. She found this out because she asked about it directly, which was perhaps not the most delicate approach. But she had been curious, and she was not in the habit of suppressing curiosity when the information wasn't any particular secret. "Shakespeare?" she said, when she noticed the spine. He looked up from the harness he was oiling. "Problem?" "No." She tilted her head to read the other titles. "I just wouldn't have guessed." "Most people don't guess right about most things," he said, and went back to the harness. She thought about that for longer than she should have. The neighbors were another matter. The Braddock Ranch was the closest to the Holloway property, separated by about a mile and a half of open grazing land. The Braddocks were an older couple, Gus and May, who had been in the valley longer than almost anyone, and whose opinion accordingly carried weight with the other ranching families in the area. Naomi knew all of this from Jasper, who mentioned it in the offhand way he mentioned everything important, as though it were a minor footnote rather than essential context. She met May Braddock in early May, when the older woman rode over one afternoon in a buggy and pulled up in the yard while Naomi was hanging washing. She was a big-boned woman in her 60s with the direct eyes of someone who had made up her mind about something before she arrived, but was willing to revise if sufficiently motivated. "You're the one from the depot," May said. Naomi was beginning to feel this was how she would be identified for the rest of her natural life. "Naomi Bennett," she said. "Yes." May looked at Eli, who was in the basket near the line, awake and occupied with the serious business of attempting to fit his foot in his mouth. She looked at Naomi. She looked at the washing on the line and at the house behind it. "Wade let you hang laundry on his fence line," she said. "He didn't object to it," Naomi said carefully. "He objected to it when I suggested he could use the fence line for something other than fences," May said. 7 years ago. He wasn't what you'd call flexible about it." Naomi didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. May climbed down from the buggy with the slightly labored efficiency of someone whose knees had opinions. She walked over to the basket and looked down at Eli with the frank assessment of a woman who had raised children and wasn't sentimental about it. "Boy looks healthy," she said. "He is, thank you." "Wade know what he's got himself into?" It was such a blunt question that Naomi almost laughed. "I'm not sure that's how I'd characterize the situation. I'm his housekeeper." "Sure you are," May said, without particular judgment, but also without believing it, or at least not believing it entirely. "Gus says it's none of his business. I told him he was right. That didn't stop me coming over to see for myself." She straightened up. "You seem sensible." "I'm trying to be." "That's a reasonable answer." May looked at the house again. "How's he treating you?" "Fairly," Naomi said. "He's fair." May made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism, somewhere in between. "He's a man who doesn't know how to have people around," she said. "He didn't used to be. Something happened back before he came here. He doesn't talk about it, and I don't ask, but it changed him some. Made him careful. You'll run into that carefulness, and you'll think it's coldness, and it ain't, quite, just so you know." She climbed back into the buggy, gathered the reins, and said, as a kind of parting observation, "That baby's going to want for nothing on this ranch, if he stays long enough. Wade Holloway doesn't know it yet, but he's going to love that boy something fierce." She drove off before Naomi could figure out what to say to that. Well, Naomi spent that evening thinking about what May Braddock had said, and thinking about what she'd observed in 5 weeks, and finding that they fit together in a way that was either reassuring or complicated, or possibly both. Wade Holloway was not what the town thought he was. The town thought he was cold, an odd, solitary man who kept to himself because he was either hiding something or simply unable to manage normal human contact. What Naomi was beginning to understand was something both simpler and stranger. He was a man who had learned to keep himself at a specific and deliberate distance from everything that mattered to him, and who was slowly, reluctantly, apparently against his better judgment, failing to maintain that distance with her and Eli. It showed up in small things. The second chair that appeared at the kitchen table one morning without comment, as though it had always been there. The way he'd started adjusting his route back from the range, so that he came past the yard where she worked rather than directly to the barn. The fact that he'd begun talking, sometimes, at meals. Nothing revealing, just observations about the herd or the weather or something Jasper had done that morning that deserved recording. But talking, which was more than he'd done in the first 2 weeks. And Eli. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had fully expected Wade Holloway to regard Eli as a complication at best, a problem at worst. Instead, he regarded Eli the way he regarded everything he was trying to work out, with careful, sustained attention. He didn't talk to the baby, not yet, but he watched him. He noticed when Eli was fussing before Naomi did, 3 times now, and each time he had said something quietly. "He's up," or "I think he's hungry," with the slightly hesitant tone of a man not sure if this observation was welcome, but offering it anyway. Once, returning from the barn earlier than expected, he'd found Eli on the kitchen floor trying to figure out how to crawl, rocking forward on his hands and knees with the furious concentration of a baby who knows what he wants to do but can't quite close the gap between intention and execution. Wade had stopped in the doorway, and he'd watched for almost a full minute before he seemed to realize Naomi was watching him watch the baby. He'd said, "He's working on something," in a perfectly neutral tone, and gone to wash up. But he'd smiled just for a second before he turned away. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. It was small and crooked and over immediately, but it was there. In the second week of June, Naomi made what she would later think of as her first real mistake at the Holloway Ranch. It wasn't catastrophic. In the context of everything that had happened and would happen, it was almost minor. But it was the kind of mistake that matters not for what it breaks, but for what it reveals. And what it revealed was that she had started thinking of the ranch as home before she had any particular right to do so. She reorganized the kitchen, not dramatically. She moved the dishes to a more logical configuration, put the most used pans where they were easier to reach, bought a new length of oilcloth for the shelf from her own wages, and laid it out clean and flat. She added a few dried herbs from the kitchen garden. She'd started one in the small patch by the south side of the house without asking, because the ground was good and she had seeds and no one had said she couldn't. She had done all of this sensibly and methodically and without once stopping to consider that this was not her kitchen, not her house, not her ranch, and that a man who had been very particular about his fence line might also be very particular about his shelves. Wade came in from a long afternoon and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at it, all of it. The rearranged shelves, the oilcloth, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam. Naomi, standing at the stove, felt the silence shift in a way that was different from his usual silences. "I reorganized," she said, which was obvious. "I should have asked." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Where are the tin cups?" "Left side of the second shelf. I put them with the plates since they were on the right side of the bottom shelf," he said. Not loud, not angry, exactly, but flat in a way that was different from his regular flatness. "I know. I moved them because the second shelf is easier to reach, and you use them more than—" "I know where things are in this house," Wade said, "because they've been in the same places for 6 years." Naomi took the tin cups from the second shelf and put them back on the right side of the bottom shelf. She did it without comment and without apology beyond the one she'd already made, because she'd made a mistake and acknowledged it, and repeating herself would just be noise. Wade sat down. She put food in front of him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then, somewhere in the middle of supper, he said, "The oilcloth was a good idea." She looked at him. He was looking at his plate. "Thank you," she said. Another silence. Then, "The cups can stay where you put them." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make it bigger than it needed to be. She just noted it and moved on, and he did the same. And by morning, the kitchen felt like it had already incorporated the small argument and healed around it, the way new country absorbs disruption and then just keeps going. What Naomi found over those first months was that the hardest part of the arrangement was not the work and not the loneliness and not the town's opinion and not even the days when Eli was difficult and tired and she was trying to accomplish 12 things at once and managing about 6. The hardest part was the specific feeling of living inside someone else's carefully maintained limits. Wade Holloway was not unkind. She had been sure of that by the end of the first week. He was precise and contained and sometimes so thoroughly interior that she could spend an entire day with him in the house and feel that she'd passed him on a road rather than shared a space with him. But he was fair. He was reliable. He was honest in a way that was almost startling on a frontier where honesty was often the first casualty of necessity. And he was kind to Eli in a way that was consistent and unpracticed, and therefore somehow more trustworthy than anything deliberate could have been. By July, Eli had started pulling himself up on furniture. He was building toward walking with the unsteady ambition of a baby who has decided that crawling is beneath him even though he isn't quite ready for the alternative. He pulled himself up on chair legs and table legs, and the edge of the settle in the main room, and twice on Wade's boot when Wade happened to be sitting nearby and represented the nearest available vertical surface. The first time it happened, Naomi was across the room and she started to apologize and moved to retrieve Eli, and Wade put up one hand, a brief gesture, meaning leave him. He looked down at the baby gripping his boot with both fists and the intense concentration of someone doing something important, and his face did the thing it did when something moved him that he wasn't planning to show. "He's got a grip," Wade said. "He does," Naomi said. Eli looked up at that moment, directly at Wade's face, the way infants do when they want to confirm that the surface they are gripping is in fact attached to something alive, and produced one of the wide, gum-filled smiles that were his primary means of communication when he was in a good humor. Wade looked at that smile for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "All right." Naomi turned back to what she was doing and said nothing, because there are moments that belong to the people inside them, and the wisest thing you can do is let them pass without annotation. But she thought about it later. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about a man who had spent 6 years with 2 hooks by the door and 1 chair at the table and tin cups on the bottom right shelf, and nobody who needed him for anything except labor. And she thought that perhaps what May Braddock had seen coming was already, quietly, well underway. And she thought, though she wasn't ready to say it yet, wasn't sure she had the right to frame it that way, that the life she was building inside someone else's careful limits was starting, in small and irreversible ways, to feel like it was hers too. The summer settled over the Holloway Ranch in the particular way that high-altitude Colorado summers do. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a door thrown open. By August, the days were long and hot, and the nights still cold enough that Naomi kept a blanket folded at the foot of Eli's cot, and the work had found its shape. And the shape was harder than she'd anticipated, but also more bearable than she'd feared, which she supposed was the most honest way to describe most things worth doing. Eli turned 10 months old and then 11, and the walking that had seemed imminent in July kept being almost there. He would cruise along the furniture, letting go with one hand and then losing his nerve and grabbing back, standing unsupported for 3 seconds before sitting down hard with an expression of genuine indignation at his own body's failure to cooperate. Naomi watched this with the particular mix of amusement and ache that she was beginning to understand was just the baseline feeling of raising a child, the constant simultaneous desire for them to grow, and the knowledge that every step forward was also a step away from what they'd been the day before. Wade watched it too, though he would not have said so. She caught him, on a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of August, standing in the doorway of the main room watching Eli attempt the distance between the settle and the kitchen table. About 6 feet of open floor that represented the longest unsupported stretch Eli had yet attempted. Wade had come in early, something about a fence line on the east pasture that needed checking by morning, and he'd stopped in the doorway without announcing himself, and he was just watching, with his arms at his sides and his hat in his hand, and his face had the open, unguarded quality that it only had when he thought no one was looking at him. Eli made it 3 steps, then sat down. Wade let out a short, quiet breath that was almost a laugh. "He's close," Naomi said from the kitchen, and Wade's expression closed back up to its regular configuration, like a hand folding. "Getting there," he agreed and went to hang up his hat. She didn't make anything of it. She had learned by now that the worst thing she could do with Wade Holloway's unguarded moments was to acknowledge them directly, because acknowledgement made him retreat 6 feet for every foot she'd gained. The only way to make progress with him was to let progress happen on its own schedule and not hold it up to the light. What she had not fully reckoned with was that she was having the same problem with herself. The gossip in Colton had not quieted. If anything, it had organized. Ruth Garfield, who Naomi now understood was the town's primary curator of other people's business, had developed a specific narrative about the situation at the Holloway Ranch that she shared with anyone who stood still long enough to hear it. A desperate widow with another man's child had installed herself in a lonely rancher's home and was maneuvering herself into a position of permanent establishment. The fact that Naomi was technically employed, technically paid wages, technically a housekeeper in every practical sense of the word, was an inconvenience to this narrative that Ruth handled by simply not including it. Naomi heard versions of this story back from 3 different sources over the course of August, including from Jasper, who relayed it with the frank embarrassment of someone who felt obligated to deliver information he personally found distasteful. "Figured you ought to know," Jasper said. He was oiling his saddle on the fence rail, not looking at her. "What they're saying." "I appreciate that," Naomi said. She was mending a shirt and she kept mending it. "Wade knows too. Someone told Gus Braddock and Gus told him, because Gus is the kind of man who thinks you should know what people say about you, even when knowing doesn't help." "What did Wade say?" Jasper paused in his work. "He said, Naomi Bennett works hard and she's good with accounts and she keeps the house. And what people say about it in town is their business and not mine." He went back to oiling, which is Wade's way of saying he doesn't care, and also his way of saying he does care, but he's not going to show it. Naomi put the shirt in her lap. "That's a lot of reading into 11 words. "I've known him 8 years, Jasper said. "You learn to read the spaces." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. What she hadn't told Jasper, and hadn't let herself think about too directly, was that the gossip was doing something to her that she hadn't expected. Not the version that circulated in Colton, which she could dismiss as small-town pattern-making, but the underlying question embedded in it, the one that asked, without mercy, "What exactly is this arrangement, and what do you want it to be?" She had arrived at the Holloway Ranch as an employee in a desperate situation. That was true, and she had never pretended otherwise. But sometime between Eli's fever in April and the tin cups being moved back to the bottom shelf and the quiet evening when Wade had watched her son cruise the furniture and let out that almost laugh, sometime in there, the word arrangement had started to feel insufficient for what was actually happening in that house, which was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. She had been wrong once before about what a man's letters meant versus what he would actually provide, and that mistake had cost her 2,000 miles and the better part of her reserves and an infant in a strange town with no one to turn to. She was not going to make the same mistake in the same way. But she was apparently capable of making it in an entirely different way, which was to stand in a man's kitchen making his coffee and quietly, incrementally, begin to love the life she was borrowing. She told herself this was manageable. She told herself she was being sensible. She was very good at telling herself things. September came in cooler than August and wetter, which Jasper said was unusual but not alarming, and then October arrived and split the difference by being both warm and genuinely alarming in the ways that mattered. The storm that hit the valley on the 3rd Saturday of October came with almost no warning. That was the thing she would keep coming back to afterward, the thing that made the whole event feel like a story with an unfair narrative structure. There had been signs, apparently, that a man who knew the country's weather patterns might have read. But Naomi had not grown up reading those signs, and Wade had been out at the Far East pasture since early morning, and she had been inside most of the day occupied with Eli, who had finally, 3 weeks earlier, begun walking in earnest and was now in the phase of walking where everything stationary in the house was a thing to walk toward and knock over. The sky went green in the way that people who've lived through serious weather recognize instantly, and people who haven't will spend the rest of their lives talking about. Naomi noticed it through the kitchen window at about 2 in the afternoon. The color was wrong. Not just dark, not just overcast, but a specific sickly shade that had no business being in the sky, and the air had a pressure to it that made her ears feel strange. Then the wind hit, not gradually, not as an increasing breeze. The wind hit the house the way a fist hits a table, all at once, and the windows rattled in their frames, and something in the yard, the wash line, she thought, went over with a crack she could hear through the walls. Eli, who had been toddling between the kitchen and the main room in an endless, satisfied loop, stopped and sat down and looked at the ceiling. Naomi crossed the kitchen and picked him up. She went to the window and looked out and couldn't see much. The dust the wind had picked up made a wall of brown that reduced visibility to maybe 30 yards. But she could hear the herd. Not just the low, distant noise of cattle going about their business, but the different agitated sound of animals that have detected something wrong and can't decide which direction to go with that information. She thought, where is Wade? She thought East Pasture is a mile and a half out. She thought, the creek runs east of the pasture, and if it's raining this hard north of here, that creek is going to come up fast. These three thoughts arrived in rapid sequence, and she stood at the window holding Eli and let them assemble into a picture she didn't want to look at. Then the sky opened. It was not rain the way she understood rain. It was more like the sky had been holding something back for a long time and had finally lost patience with the effort. The rain came down in a solid mass that made the yard disappear entirely and turned the track from the barn to the house into a river in under 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she was counting, Eli on her hip, watching the water level rise in the yard from the window. The barn. She needed to check whether the barn was secured. She put Eli on the floor of the main room, in the corner between the settle and the wall, which was the most enclosed space available. "Stay," she said, which was what she'd been saying to him when she needed him to stay still for the 90 seconds it took her to do something with both hands. He was not reliably obedient about this, but he was better than he'd been a month ago. She pulled on her coat and went to the back door and opened it. The water in the yard was 6 inches deep and moving, not standing water, flowing water, purposeful, with the kind of direction that meant it was coming from somewhere and going somewhere else and gathering strength as it went. The barn was 30 yards away. She could see the shape of it through the rain, barely, and she could hear the horses inside, 2 of them, the animals Wade kept for ranch work, moving in their stalls with the particular anxious energy of horses that know something is wrong. She thought about Wade again. Whoever was out in this had to get to high ground. The creek east of the pasture, if it was up, if the herd had scattered. She was still thinking it through when she heard Eli. Not his ordinary fussing sound, not the I want something sound or the tired sound, but the specific high-register cry that he only made when he was frightened or hurt, and she was back through the door and across the main room in 10 seconds. The corner where she'd left him was empty. Her heart made a motion she had no good word for. She scanned the room, settle, table, fireplace, doorway, and saw him at the far side of the room, near the window that faced east, standing against it with both palms pressed flat against the glass, the way he did when he was watching something outside. The window. The water outside had reached the base of it. She reached him in 4 steps and picked him up, and he was still making the frightened sound, and she thought, the water is coming in under the door. She looked, and it was a thin dark line of it seeping under the front door, not yet significant, but with the quiet inevitability of something that was only going to keep getting worse. She went to the highest point in the house, which was the bedroom, Wade's room, which she'd been in exactly twice in the months she'd lived there, both times to change the bedding, and she stood on the bed with Eli on her hip and looked out the bedroom window at the yard. The water was still rising. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard the door. She'd been on the bed long enough that Eli had gone from frightened to confused to bored and was now trying to pull the buttons off her coat with the single-minded focus that characterized his engagement with most small objects. The bedroom was above the floor level enough that the rising water in the lower rooms wasn't immediately a problem, but she could hear it, the particular sound of water moving through enclosed space, a low patient sound that she would hear in her sleep for weeks afterward. The door, the back door, and then boots on the floor and her name, said the way a person says a name when they are trying not to shout it, but are very close to shouting. Naomi. Bedroom, she called. He was there in seconds. He'd come in through the back, which meant he'd come through the yard, and he was drenched to the bone, hat gone, mud to the knee on both sides, a cut above his left eyebrow that she immediately categorized as not serious, but definitely present. He looked at her on the bed holding Eli, and the thing that crossed his face was not relief, exactly. It was more like the absence of something that had been sitting on his chest since he saw the storm coming and started riding back. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. "We're all right. The water's in the front room, maybe 3 or 4 inches. I came up here when—" "The creek's up," he said, "about 2 feet over its banks. It'll run east of the yard, but the low ground around the front of the house is going to sit for a while." He looked at the window, gauging something she couldn't read. "Fences are down on the south pasture, 3 of them for certain, maybe more. Herds scattered. Jasper, Braddock's place. I was there when it hit. He's fine." He looked at the cut above his eye, which she could tell he'd forgotten about because he had the slightly unfocused quality of a man running on emergency fuel who hasn't yet stopped to take inventory of himself. South fence went while I was trying to hold a section. Post caught me on the way down. Sit down, she said. I need to get back out there. The herd will still be scattered in 10 minutes, she said. Sit down. He sat on the edge of the bed. She handed Eli to him. Not quite a decision, more a practical transfer, both hands needed. And Eli, who in the ordinary way of things was sometimes uncertain about Wade's arms and sometimes not, grabbed a fistful of Wade's wet shirt and held on with the grip that Jasper had once said could shame a grown man, and Wade's arm went around the boy automatically, the way a reflex does before he'd done any thinking about it. She found a clean cloth and dealt with the cut, which was shallow, but had bled more than shallow cuts tend to because head wounds are unreliable that way. He sat still for it with the patience of a man who has been through enough that a cut above the eye barely registers, but she noticed that his arm stayed around Eli the whole time, and that Eli, for reasons known only to infants and the logic of pure feeling, had stopped crying and gone quiet. It's not deep, she said. It'll be sore. It's fine. It's fine. I know it's fine. I'm telling you what it is. A beat. Then, thank you. She pressed the cloth to it. He looked at her from about 12 inches away, closer than they usually stood. And she didn't move back, and he didn't move back, and the rain outside was still coming down, though lighter now, the worst of it passing. Were you scared? He said. It was such an unexpected question that she looked at him directly, which she didn't usually do from 12 inches. Yes, she said. Were you? He glanced down at Eli, who had now relocated the button project to Wade's shirt with complete contentment. Riding back in that, he said, when I could see the water running and I didn't know if you'd... He stopped, started again. Yes, he said. I was scared. She held the cloth to his face, and neither of them said anything else, and the rain came down and Eli pulled at buttons, and the water in the front room made its patient sound below them, and Naomi thought, this is the moment, right here. This is the one that changes the shape of everything that comes after it. She didn't say that. She said, can you hold him while I check the front room? Yes, Wade said. She went to check the front room. The damage to the ranch was considerable, but not catastrophic, which was how Jasper framed it when he rode over the following morning with Gus Braddock and 2 of the Braddock hands to help assess and begin repairs. 3 fence lines down, about 40 heads scattered across a 3-mile range, which Jasper said was bad, but recoverable. A section of the barn roof that had lifted at one corner and would need to be resecured before the next rain. The yard itself looked like something had simply picked it up and rearranged it, tools scattered, the wash line wrapped around a fence post 50 yards from where it had started, standing water in the low spots that would take 2 days to drain. The house had fared better than she'd feared. The water in the front room had reached about 4 inches at its peak and receded as the yard drained, leaving a water line on the lower walls and a floor that would need to be dried carefully before it warped. The main furniture was elevated enough to have escaped the worst of it. 3 of the oilcloth-covered shelves in the kitchen had taken on water, and the provisions she'd organized on them were ruined. The flour and most of the dried goods, which meant a significant resupply trip. But the stove was undamaged, and the structure of the house itself was sound. Wade had been out since before dawn with Gus and the hands, riding the scattered herd back together. Naomi kept Eli on her back in the sling and worked the house, mopping and drying and salvaging what could be salvaged and making a clear-eyed list of what couldn't. She found a rhythm for it, the same way she'd found a rhythm for everything at the ranch, which was to stop trying to see the whole problem and instead do the next available thing, and then the one after that. May Braddock arrived mid-morning with her buggy loaded with provisions. A sack of flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, a jar of preserved peaches, and a covered pot of stew that she set on the stove with the authority of a woman who knew this kitchen wasn't hers, but considered that a minor detail. Figured you'd be short on stores, May said. We are. Thank you, May. May looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of someone who has survived several disasters and knows what the aftermath looks like. Could have been worse, she said, considerably. We were lucky. Luck had something to do with it, May agreed. She sat down in the second chair, the one that had appeared at the table in June and had been there ever since. and looked at Naomi with an expression that was both kind and perceptive in the way that May's expressions tended to be. Wade got back before the creek peaked? Yes. Good. She paused. How'd he seem? Naomi wasn't sure how to answer that, not because she didn't know, but because what she knew didn't fit neatly into the size of a casual answer. He was fine, she said. Once he knew we were all right, he was fine. May watched her for a moment. Naomi. May. You know what I told you back in May, about how he was going to love that boy without knowing it? I remember. I was wrong about one part of it. Naomi looked at her. It's not just the boy, May said. The kitchen was very quiet except for Eli investigating the leg of the table and the sound of the stove and the distant sound of men and horses in the yard. Naomi turned back to the shelf she was drying and said, That's a complicated thing to know what to do with. Most true things are, May said, and stood up and started helping with the shelves. The herd was largely recovered within 4 days, which Wade credited to the terrain being familiar enough that the cattle hadn't gone far, into the draws and low hills east of the ranch, rather than straight across open country, which meant they were findable, and the losses were only 2 head, both found too far into the creek bed to have survived. The fences took longer. 3 weeks of steady work, Wade and Jasper, and borrowed labor from the Braddock hands, and the South Pasture fence in particular, had to be rebuilt from scratch in 2 sections because the posts had been driven out of the ground by the water pressure, and the wood in one section had cracked in ways that made repair impractical. Naomi watched the work from the house and from the yard, managing the ranch's domestic operations, and managing Eli and managing the resupply logistics. And she watched Wade work in a way she was only partly conscious of, which was a problem she was getting worse at pretending didn't exist. He worked the way he did everything, steadily, without theatrics, paying attention to the next thing in front of him, and then the thing after that. He didn't complain about the damage, and he didn't spend time being angry about the storm, which she had seen other men do with bad luck, converting it into a grievance that radiated outward and needed to be managed by everyone around them. Wade took the storm as a fact and worked on the facts it had produced and moved on. What she was not expecting was the conversation they had on the second Thursday of November, in the evening after Jasper had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Eli was asleep, and she was at the kitchen table working through the ranch accounts, which she'd been maintaining since September, in a ledger that had started as her private system for understanding the ranch's finances and had gradually, through a process neither of them had explicitly authorized, become the official record. Wade came in from checking the stock, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from her. He looked at the ledger. She'd expected him to not comment on it the way he didn't comment on most things, but instead he said, "Can I see that?" She pushed it across. He turned it toward him and looked at it for a while. She watched his face work through the numbers. He could read accounts, she'd established that earlier. He just didn't enjoy doing it. "We're up," he said. "The storm was expensive, but you went into it with enough reserve. And the cattle sale in September was better than the previous year." 14%, he said, which was what the ledger showed. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. Then, "You did that." "I did the accounts. You run a profitable ranch." "I was getting about a third of that back when I was managing my own books," he said. He said it flatly, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation about a fact he was incorporating. "The bulk purchasing helped, and I caught 2 supplier agreements where you were paying above market rate. Fixed those in August." He looked at her. "You didn't tell me about that." "I handled it. I didn't think you needed the detail." "It's my money." "It is," she said evenly. "Would you like me to tell you everything I do with the accounts going forward? I can do that, or I can continue handling the details and reporting the results. Either way is fine." He was quiet for a moment. "The second one," he said. "Results." She pulled the ledger back. He didn't move to leave. She went back to the column she'd been working on. After a while, he said, without preamble, "Eli said a word today." She looked up immediately. "What?" "I was carrying him out to see the new fence post. Jasper was driving it in. Eli was watching it, and he said—" He paused, with the careful quality of a man who wants to get this right. It sounded like bang, when Jasper hit the post. Naomi sat back in her chair. Eli's first word. She'd missed it because she'd been inside doing accounts, and Wade had been the one carrying him, and that was just how it had happened. And the feeling that moved through her was not simple, and she let it move without trying to name it. Bang, she said. Something like it. Maybe bah. I'm not entirely sure, but it was in response to the sound, deliberate. She looked at the man across the table from her, this man who had been here for it, who had thought to remember it and bring it back to her like something precious. And she thought about what it meant that he had known it was worth remembering, that he had understood the weight of it without anyone telling him what weight to assign. Thank you for telling me, she said. He looked at his coffee cup. Seemed like the kind of thing you'd want to know. It was. She went back to the accounts, and he stayed at the table and didn't say anything else for a long time, and the lamp threw their shadows against the wall in the quiet kitchen, and outside the November wind came down off the mountain the way it did this time of year, steady and cold and patient, and inside the house was warm. What broke the shape of things was not a single moment, but a series of them, each small enough on its own that she could have reframed any one of them as ordinary, but together they formed something too coherent to dismiss. The moment in October when Wade held Eli through the whole storm, unasked, as though the child's weight in his arms were simply where it belonged. The Eli's first word moment in November. The evening 3 days after the flood, when she was carrying water from the recovered well and slipped on the still wet ground, just a slip, caught herself before she fell. But Wade was beside her in 3 steps with his hand on her arm before she'd had time to register that she was all right, and the hand had stayed there for a long moment after she was steady, and neither of them mentioned it afterward. And then there was the moment with Ruth Garfield's husband. Mel Garfield came out to the ranch in mid-November on the pretext of inquiring about a cattle trade that Naomi suspected was not the actual reason for the visit. He was a big man, confident in the particular way of men who have never had their confidence seriously tested, and he looked at the house and at Naomi and at the accounting ledger she was working on and said, with the easy presumption of someone who considered himself above social delicacy, "So you've made yourself right at home out here." "I work here," Naomi said. "Sure you do." He looked around the kitchen with an appraiser's eye. "Ruth says you've been doing more than keeping house." "Ruth is welcome to her opinions," Naomi said. She kept her voice pleasant. She was very good at keeping her voice pleasant. "It's other people's opinions I'd be thinking about if I were you," Mel said. "Woman in your situation, alone out here with a man who's— Is there something I can help you with regarding the cattle?" Naomi said. "Or would you prefer to wait for Mr. Holloway? He's expected back within the hour." Mel looked at her with the slightly nonplussed expression of a man who had prepared for various responses and hadn't prepared for this one. "I'll wait," he said. "You're welcome to wait in the yard," Naomi said pleasantly and firmly, and turned back to her ledger. She heard him go out. She sat with the ledger in front of her, and her jaw tight, and her hands not quite steady on the pen, and she breathed through it the way she breathed through most things, slowly and without making it visible. When Wade came back, he found Mel Garfield in the yard and heard the cattle trade inquiry, which took about 3 minutes, and then Mel left and Wade came inside and looked at Naomi's face. "What did he say?" Wade said. Not her question. "Nothing worth repeating." "Naomi." She looked up. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention he brought to things he intended to understand properly. "He implied," she said, "that my presence here reflects poorly on both of us, and that I should consider what people think." Wade's jaw tightened in a way she'd learned to read as the closest he came to visible anger. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to leave?" She looked at him. "No." "Then don't," he said. "What Mel Garfield thinks about it doesn't enter into anything. It might affect your standing with the other ranchers." "I've managed my standing with the other ranchers for 8 years without help from Mel Garfield," Wade said. "I'll continue." He went to wash up for supper. She went back to the ledger, and the thing that settled in the house after Mel Garfield's buggy disappeared down the road was not quite the same thing that had been there before he arrived. It was something slightly more decided, slightly more solid, like ground that's been walked on enough times to compress into a reliable path. December came and the mountain cold came with it, and the ranch contracted inward the way ranches do in winter. Fewer reasons to ride far out, more work concentrated close to home, days shorter and heavier with the particular silence of snow. Eli took his first fully unassisted walk across the main room on a Tuesday in the first week of December. 6 steps, Clear floor, nobody holding his hand. He sat down at the end of it with an expression of pure satisfaction, like a man who has just proved a point he has been arguing for some time. Naomi made a sound that was half laugh, half something she couldn't keep all the way contained. Wade, who had been at the table reading, stood up from his chair. He crossed the room, crouched down to Eli's level, and said, with a gravity that was entirely genuine, "That was good." Eli looked at him and produced the smile that had been undoing Wade Holloway since April, the wide-open one that contained no self-consciousness whatsoever, and then reached out and put both hands on Wade's face in the imperious way he had when he wanted someone's full attention. Wade went very still. He let the baby's hands sit on his face. He looked at Eli with an expression so unprotected that Naomi looked away, because it was the kind of thing a person deserves to have privately. "Pa," Eli said. The room went so quiet she could hear the fire. It was likely a coincidence, likely a sound Eli had been assembling from the sounds around him, likely not a deliberate address. She told herself this. She told herself the word had no weight it didn't have before it was said. But Wade's hands had come up and held Eli's wrists, gently, and he was looking at the boy with an expression Naomi had never seen on his face before. And the expression was not complicated at all. It was the simplest thing she'd seen in that house in 7 months. It was a man understanding, all at once, exactly what he had to lose. He didn't say anything. He helped Eli stand up and let him toddle back across the room. He sat back down at the table. He opened his book. Naomi watched her son walk away from the man who had just been named without being asked, and she sat with the feeling that put in her chest, and she understood at last. Not with her head, she'd understood it with her head for months, but in the way that actually means something, the way that requires the body's participation, that she was not borrowing a life here. She was building one. The question was not whether this was home. The question was whether home was what Wade Holloway would let it become, and whether she was brave enough to ask. She had walked 2,000 miles and buried her first husband and arrived in a stranger's town with $12 in her boot and taken a job nobody else would give her and survived a flood and managed a ranch she'd never been trained for, and she had done all of it one available action at a time. She could do this the same way, but not tonight. Tonight she put supper on the table and watched Eli fall asleep in the corner of the settle, curled into a compact arrangement of satisfied baby, and listened to the fire and let the house be what it was. Warm and imperfect and full of things that had not yet been said, and told herself that tomorrow was time enough to be brave. Tomorrow, as it turned out, did not arrive on Naomi's schedule. It arrived instead on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December, in the form of a hired coach coming up the road from Colton with 2 passengers inside it and a third piece of luggage strapped to the roof that suggested whoever was coming intended to stay longer than a social call. Naomi saw it from the kitchen window. She was making bread. Her hands were in the dough, and she looked out at the sound of wheels on the frozen track and felt something shift in her chest before she'd even identified who the passengers were. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. The woman who stepped down from the coach first was Margaret Alcott, her late husband Thomas's older sister. Margaret was 52, dressed well in the Eastern fashion that looked faintly theatrical against the backdrop of a Colorado ranch yard in December, and she carried herself with the deliberate composure of a woman who had decided before she arrived how she intended to feel about what she found. Behind her came her husband Arthur, a thin, pleasant-faced man who had always been kinder to Naomi than the family situation strictly required, and who now looked at the ranch house and the bare mountains behind it with an expression of barely concealed alarm. "Naomi," Margaret said, not warmly exactly, but not cold. Something in between that suggested she was keeping her options open. Naomi stood in the doorway with flour on her hands and Eli on her hip. She'd picked him up automatically when she heard the coach, which she would later think about, and said, "Margaret, Arthur, I didn't know you were coming." "We wrote," Margaret said, 3 weeks ago. "The mail from the east takes time out here. I didn't receive it." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. It's cold." She had met Margaret Alcott exactly 4 times in her life. Twice before the wedding, once at the wedding itself, and once at Thomas's funeral where Margaret had been in the specific grief of a woman who has lost her brother and needed somewhere to put the blame for the circumstances that led to it. And Naomi, who was also grieving and also newly responsible for a baby, and also the only other person in the room whose life had been most disrupted, had been the available target. The marriage to Thomas had not been Margaret's preferred outcome for her brother. Thomas had been meant, in the Alcott family's private narrative, for a woman with more social standing and less practicality. Naomi had been practical in ways that Margaret considered faintly inappropriate. She kept the books. She managed the household with a directness that some people called competence, and Margaret called briskness. She had opinions about things that, in Margaret's view, were not within a wife's proper scope of concern. When Thomas died and left Naomi with Eli and a negligible estate, Margaret had offered a solution. Come live with the Alcotts in their Cincinnati home, accept a modest allowance, be respectable and grateful and nearby. Naomi had written back a polite letter declining the offer and then written to the Frontier Marriage Bureau 6 weeks later, and Margaret had been discovering what she thought about that decision ever since. The kitchen was warm. Naomi put on coffee and sliced the bread from yesterday's baking, which she'd been saving for the week's meals but which social necessity now overrode. Eli sat down on the floor, made his way to the table leg and began his standard evaluation of it. Arthur watched this with genuine delight. Margaret watched it with the more complicated expression of a woman trying to assess whether a child is thriving or merely surviving. "He's walking," Margaret said. "For about 2 weeks now," Naomi said. "He looks well." "He is well." Arthur leaned down from his chair and extended a finger, which Eli examined seriously and then grabbed. "Strong grip," Arthur said, and looked up at Naomi with a smile that she returned because Arthur had always been easy. Margaret looked around the kitchen with the same appraiser's eye that Mel Garfield had used in November, though with a different purpose behind it. She looked at the oilcloth shelves, the organized pantry, the second chair at the table, the ledger on the corner shelf. She looked at the house the way you look at something you expected to find in a certain condition and haven't. "It's a decent house," she said, which for Margaret was approximately a standing ovation. "It is," Naomi agreed. "Mr. Holloway keeps it up." "Mr. Holloway," Margaret said, with a particular quality of repetition that suggested she was filing the name and its inflection away for future examination. "He's out with the herd. He'll be back around noon." The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape to it. Margaret assembling her approach, Naomi waiting to see what form it would take. It was Arthur who filled it, asking about the ranch, about the country, about the winter, with the genuine curiosity of a man who had spent his life in a city and found the mechanics of a different existence interesting rather than threatening. Naomi answered him and was grateful for the cover. Wade came back at 11:30. She heard him in the yard. She'd been listening for him, she admitted this to herself, and she went to the back door and caught him before he came in through the kitchen, which she preferred to manage deliberately rather than by accident. "I have company," she said. "My husband's family. His sister Margaret and her husband Arthur. They've come from Cincinnati." Wade stopped on the back step and looked at her. Whatever he made of this, and she could see him making something of it, the slight shift in his attention that meant he was reorganizing information, he kept it inside. "All right," he said. "Margaret is—" She stopped. How to say this accurately? "She has a particular idea of what my life should look like. She came out here expecting to find a specific situation, and she's adjusting to finding a different one." "What kind of situation did she expect?" "A desperate one," Naomi said. "She expected to find me desperate." Wade looked at her for a moment. "And she didn't." "And she didn't." He nodded once. "I'll wash up," he said, and went to the pump. She went back inside and told Margaret and Arthur that Mr. Holloway would be joining them shortly. Margaret straightened slightly in her chair. Arthur said, Good, good," with the relief of a man who finds conversational reinforcements welcome. Wade came in, and the dynamic in the room changed the way dynamics change when a new person enters any enclosed space. A settling and reconfiguring, everyone finding a new position relative to everyone else. I was polite in the way that he was polite, which was to say without warmth but without the opposite of warmth either. A steady, civil attention that he gave to Arthur's questions about the ranch and the winter and the cattle operation with the same care he gave to everything he decided deserved care. Margaret watched him. Naomi watched Margaret watching him. What Margaret was looking for, Naomi suspected, was evidence of the arrangement she'd heard about. Because Margaret had clearly heard about it, The too-studied neutrality of her expression told you that much. She was looking for something inappropriate, something confirming, something that would allow her to frame this as the rescue operation she'd come here to conduct. She was looking at a man who set a plate down in front of Eli with the automatic competence of someone who has done it many times before and knew exactly how high off the table to place it so the baby could reach but not knock it over, and who then turned and poured coffee without being asked, and who sat down at his own table without any sign of either possessiveness or performance. Margaret's expression went through something subtle. It was recalibrating. "How long have you been running this ranch, Mr. Holloway?" she asked. 8 years, Wade said. "And before that?" "A beat. Missouri. My family had a farm there." "Do you have family still, out here or back east?" "No," Wade said, not elaborating. Margaret absorbed this. She glanced at Naomi, then back at Wade. "And the arrangement here has been—" She paused, choosing the word. "Satisfactory? For both parties?" "I can speak to my own satisfaction," Wade said, pleasantly and precisely. "Naomi would need to speak to hers." "Quite satisfactory," Naomi said, without hesitation. Arthur refilled his own coffee and seemed to be enjoying himself in the way that good-natured people enjoy situations that have tension they personally aren't responsible for creating. Margaret looked at them both in sequence and then looked at Eli, who had finished what was on his plate and was now looking at Wade with the expectant expression that meant he wanted to be picked up. Wade picked him up. It was not a gesture. It was not a demonstration. He simply registered that Eli wanted up, reached over, and settled the boy against his side with the ease of long practice, and Eli grabbed his shirt and looked around the table with the satisfaction of someone who has achieved the vantage point he wanted. Margaret went very still. Arthur said, "He's a good-natured child." "He is," Wade said. "Takes to people easily." "He takes to some people," Naomi said. "He's particular." Arthur looked at Eli, then at Wade, then at Naomi, and the gentle smile that crossed his face suggested he had understood several things simultaneously and found them not only acceptable, but quietly wonderful. "Well," he said, "the West suits you, Naomi. I'll say that." Margaret said nothing. The Alcott stayed 3 days, which was how long the next eastbound coach was, and the 3 days had the particular texture of time spent in the company of people who are reassessing their position without wanting to admit they're doing it. Arthur was easy throughout. He walked the ranch with Jasper, who took to him immediately in the way that Jasper took to uncomplicated men, and learned more than he'd probably expected about cattle operations and fence line maintenance and the particular challenges of Colorado winters. He came back to the house in the evenings full of information and goodwill and the slightly ruddied look of a man who had been outdoors more in 3 days than in the previous 6 months. Margaret was harder. She and Naomi had the conversation on the second afternoon while Arthur was with Jasper and Wade was checking the far pasture and Eli was asleep. It happened in the main room, both of them sitting, and it had the quality of something that had been building pressure for 2 days and needed to be released before one of them walked back to Cincinnati without it. "I came here to offer you a way out," Margaret said. She was looking at her hands, which were folded in her lap. This was unusual for Margaret, who generally preferred the authority of direct eye contact. "I know," Naomi said. "Arthur and I have discussed it at length. We have the room. Thomas's son should be—" She paused. "Eli should have stability, a settled environment, connections." "He has those things," Naomi said. Margaret looked up. "He has a ranch," she said, "in the middle of nowhere, with a man he's known for 9 months who has no particular obligation to him." "People have obligations they choose as well as obligations they're born to," Naomi said. "I've learned that out here more clearly than I understood it before." "Naomi." Margaret's voice had shifted. It was still controlled, but underneath the control there was something genuine, something that was actually concern rather than management of a problem. "I'm asking whether you're happy. Not whether you're surviving, not whether the arrangement is functional, whether you are actually happy." Naomi looked at her. She thought about the question. She took it seriously, because it deserved to be taken seriously, and because Margaret deserved credit for asking it instead of just asserting the answer. "I am," she said. "Not in the way I expected happiness to look, not without difficulty or uncertainty. But yes, Margaret, I'm happy." Margaret held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked away toward the window, and the landscape beyond it. "He looks at you," she said after a while. "Pardon?" "Holloway. He looks at you the way—" She stopped, started again. Thomas looked at his accounting books, like you're something he's still trying to fully understand but intends to keep regardless. Naomi said nothing. "I didn't come here to take Eli away from you," Margaret said. She sounded tired suddenly in a way she hadn't before. "I want you to know that. Whatever I thought I was coming to do, I wasn't coming to take him." "I know," Naomi said. And she did know. She had known that about Margaret, who was difficult in managing and convinced of her own correctness in ways that sometimes overrode her better instincts, but who was not malicious, who had, in her rigid way, actually been trying to help. "I just wanted to see," Margaret said, "that you were all right. I'm all right. More than all right from the look of things." She said it slightly ruefully, which from Margaret was the closest available thing to grace. "Arthur thinks it's the most interesting place he's ever visited. He'll be talking about that old man Jasper for years." "Jasper is one of a kind," Naomi agreed. Margaret picked up her cup. "The boy calls him Pa," she said. "He does." "Has for long?" "A few weeks." "And Holloway?" "Doesn't discourage it," Naomi said. She thought about it for a moment and then said the more accurate thing, and never looked more himself than the first time Eli said it. Margaret was quiet. She looked at her cup and then out the window and then back at Naomi, and whatever she was working through, she worked through it in the private way she preferred. And when she'd finished, she said, "I owe you an apology for after the funeral. I was," she chose the word with care, "unkind." "You were grieving," Naomi said. "I was unkind while grieving," Margaret said. "The first is not an excuse for the second." Naomi nodded. She let it be received and acknowledged and sufficient. She didn't make it larger or smaller than it was. "Thank you," she said. It was Arthur, on this evening of the second day, who did the thing that changed the shape of everything else. He and Wade were at the table after supper, Eli asleep, Margaret helping Naomi clear without being asked, which was so unprecedented that Naomi had taken it as the most significant indicator yet of a genuine internal shift. Arthur had been asking Wade questions about the cattle market, about the land, about whether there was more good range available to the east, and the conversation had the easy rhythm of two men who have found unexpected common ground. Naomi was at the basin with her back to them when Arthur said, with the complete casualness of a man who doesn't know he's detonating something, "You know, when we got Naomi's letter last spring, the one about Harlan Cross, God rest him, Margaret was convinced she'd be back in Cincinnati within a month. I told her I wasn't so sure. Naomi is one of the most capable women I've ever known, and capable women have a way of finding their footing." "She does," Wade said. "The fact that she's not just found her footing but apparently built a life here, I find that—" Arthur paused, looking for the word. "Clarifying, is that the right word? It clarifies things." "What things?" Wade asked. Arthur looked at him with the benign shrewdness of a man who appears vague but isn't. "About what she needs and what she's found," he said. "They don't always match, you know. What a person needs and what they find. When they do, you want to make sure they know it." The room was quiet. Naomi kept her hands in the water and her back to the table and breathed carefully. "I know it," Wade said, quietly, definitely. There was a pause. Then Arthur said, "Good," and refilled his own coffee, and the conversation returned to cattle markets as if nothing had happened. And Naomi stood at the basin until her hands were clean and her face was composed, and she could turn around without showing more than she meant to. Margaret was watching her from across the kitchen with an expression that was new. Something soft. Something that had more room in it than Margaret's expressions usually did. She didn't say anything. She handed Naomi the next dish. The Alcotts left on the Thursday morning coach. Arthur shook hands with Wade, and then Jasper, and then Wade again, because he'd forgotten something he wanted to say about the East Pasture's potential. He kissed Naomi on the cheek and held Eli for a minute, his face doing something complicated and private over the baby's head, and then handed him back with the air of a man returning something borrowed. Margaret stood with Naomi near the coach and said, in the crisp voice she used when she was trying to keep a feeling from showing too clearly, "Write more often." "I will," Naomi said. "And not just about the ranch accounts. About—" She made a small, uncharacteristic gesture. Things. I'll write about things, Naomi said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled her into an embrace that was brief and firm and entirely unannounced, the kind of hug you give someone when you've been wrong about them for too long and haven't got any better way to say it. Then she stepped back, straightened her coat, and climbed into the coach. Naomi stood in the yard and watched the coach go down the road and disappear around the bend, and the feeling that settled over the ranch in its absence was not emptiness. It was something closer to the quiet after weather, the kind of quiet that follows something necessary. That evening, after supper, Eli asleep, Jasper long gone to the bunkhouse, Naomi sat at the table with the accounts, and Wade sat across from her with his book, and the lamp between them threw its familiar, unsteady light across the room. She had been thinking about what Arthur said, about what Wade had said back. She had been thinking about it all day, working around it and through it and arriving at the same place from different directions, and the place she kept arriving at was simple and terrifying in equal measure. She put down her pen. She looked at the ledger and then at the lamp and then at the man across the table who was reading with the focused attention he brought to things he found genuinely worth his time, and she said, "Wade." He looked up. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without deciding how you feel about it before I've finished saying it." She paused. "Can you do that?" He studied her for a moment. "I can try," he said, which was the most honest possible answer. "I came here as your employee," she said. "That's what this was. I needed work, and you needed a housekeeper, and that was the whole of it. I understood that completely. I still understand it." She looked at her hands. "What I didn't account for was what it would become, which I don't think either of us planned, and I'm not going to pretend that I know what you want or what you think about any of it. But I need you to know what I think, because I've been not saying it for 4 months, and I've run out of reasons not to." Wade had closed his book. He was watching her with the quality of attention that was different from his usual attention, more open, more undefended, the expression she sometimes caught when he thought no one was looking. "I love this ranch," she said. "I love the work and the country, and the way this house smells in winter. I love Jasper, who is the most straightforward, impossible person I have ever met. And She stopped. She'd been planning this, or thought she had, but the planning turned out to be inadequate preparation. "I'm not in the business of saying things I'm not certain of. You know that about me by now, and I'm certain of this, so I'm saying it." She met his eyes. "I love you. I have for a while. I'm not asking you for anything in return. I just needed you to know it wasn't nothing, what this has been. For me, it wasn't nothing." The room held its breath. Wade said, "Naomi." "You don't have to—" "Naomi." Quieter. "Stop." She stopped. He put his book on the table. He looked at it for a moment, the worn cover, and then he looked at her with the expression that only appeared when he had given up trying to keep something from showing. "The night of the storm," he said, "riding back through that water. I could see the house. And I didn't know. I couldn't see any light, and I didn't know if you'd—" He stopped, tried again. "The fear I had. That's not what I feel about an employee." She waited. "I've been careful," he said. The word cost him something. About most things. About people, especially. He looked at the table. It doesn't matter what there was. Something that made careful feel like the only reasonable way to be. He was quiet for a moment. "And then you came, and you reorganized my shelves, and fixed my supplier contracts, and stayed up all night when Eli had a fever, and argued with me about tin cups. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped being able to be careful in the same way." He looked up. "I tried. I want you to know I tried. Not because I wanted you gone. Because I didn't trust what it meant that I didn't." "And now?" she said. "Now," he said. "Eli calls me Pa, and I'm not correcting him. That ought to tell you something." She almost laughed. It was such a Wade Holloway answer, oblique and exact at the same time, saying the most important thing in the least theatrical way available. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at this man who had put a second chair at his table and moved his tin cups and held her son through a flood and been scared when he rode back through the water, and she thought, yes, this, exactly this. "It tells me something," she said. "Good," he said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just for a moment, and then pulled it back in the way he did things he wasn't practiced at, with care. with the slight uncertainty of someone doing something that matters too much to do carelessly. "I should have," he said, and then stopped. And she understood he was trying to say, "I should have said this sooner," or "I should have been less careful," or possibly both. "We got here," she said. "That's enough." He looked at her for a long moment. "It is," he said. Outside, the December wind moved across the mountain and the fire shifted, and Eli slept in his small room without knowing that the two people in the kitchen had just said the thing that had been building since April, and the house was warm, and the accounts could wait, and the lamp burned steady between them. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning with snow on the ground and a pale winter sky, Wade Holloway asked Naomi Bennett to marry him. He did it the way he did most things he'd thought about seriously, plainly, without decoration, in the kitchen while she was making coffee. He said, "I'd like to make this permanent, if you're willing, you and Eli. I'd like it to be legal and official and not an arrangement anymore." She turned from the stove. He was standing near the table with his hat in his hands, which he only held that way when he was doing something that required the appearance of patience while he was actually very close to the edge of it. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "I have a condition," she said. He looked at her warily. "What condition?" "Eli's name," she said. "If he grows up calling you Pa, I want the name to follow. I want him to be Eli Holloway, not Eli Bennett." Wade looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that was large and serious and entirely his. "That's not a condition," he said, finally. "That's what I was going to ask for." She left the coffee and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he was still holding his hat, and she took it out of his hands because it seemed like the right thing to do with it. And he stood there without anything to hold on to and looked at her, and for once didn't have the expression of a man keeping something at a careful distance. He looked like a man who had come home, and across the hall, in the small room off the kitchen, where a cot had once held only a desperate woman's last option, and now held a sleeping boy who called his name without prompting, and would grow into a person shaped partly by this land and partly by this quiet, careful man, Eli Holloway. Not yet official, not yet on paper, but Eli Holloway in every way that mattered. Slept through his parents finding each other, and the ranch held them all in its winter quiet, and nothing about it was perfect, and everything about it was enough. They were married on a Thursday in January, which was not a romantic choice, but a practical one. Thursday was the day Judge Calloway came through Colton on his circuit, and Wade Holloway was not a man who saw the value in waiting for a more poetic occasion when a functional one was available. Naomi wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and showed wear at the cuffs that she'd turned and re-sewn the night before by lamplight. Wade wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and the expression of a man undergoing something significant who has decided the most dignified way to experience it is with his face as neutral as possible. Jasper stood beside them in the judge's small borrowed office above the dry goods store and held Eli for the duration of the ceremony, which took 11 minutes, and when Eli grabbed his beard 2/3 of the way through, Jasper held him tighter and didn't flinch, and Naomi loved him for it. Judge Calloway was a spare, economical man who had performed enough frontier marriages to understand that the people standing in front of him were not interested in poetry. He said the words. They said the words back. Wade put a ring on her finger that she learned later he'd ridden to the next town to buy the previous Saturday, which meant he'd ridden 40 miles round trip in December without telling anyone where he was going, and Jasper had covered for him by claiming he was checking a fence line, which was both the most transparent lie possible and entirely consistent with Jasper's approach to subtlety. The ring was plain silver. It fit. Afterward, they ate lunch at May Braddock's table, because May had declared this the plan approximately 48 hours after Naomi told her about the proposal, and nobody had found sufficient reason to argue with her. May made a meal that was emphatically celebratory. 3 courses, a tablecloth that appeared to be reserved for significant occasions, and a dried apple cake that she set in the center of the table with the authority of someone who has been waiting for an occasion worthy of it. Gus Braddock shook Wade's hand twice, the second time apparently, because the first hadn't adequately expressed whatever he was feeling. Arthur and Margaret were in Cincinnati and could not attend, but a letter arrived from Arthur 3 weeks later describing his feelings about the marriage with a warmth and specificity that made Naomi read it twice and then fold it carefully and put it in the box where she kept things worth keeping. Ruth Garfield heard about the wedding from 3 separate sources before noon, and had revised her narrative by sundown, the way people like Ruth do when the facts become too inconvenient to maintain, not admitting the previous version was wrong, just quietly installing a new one in which she had always thought the arrangement would come to this, and wasn't it a fine thing? Naomi, when she heard this second hand from May, allowed herself precisely one moment of satisfaction and then moved on, because she had learned somewhere between Cincinnati and Colton that other people's narratives about your life were only as powerful as the space you gave them. Winter deepened and the ranch moved through it, the way the ranch moved through everything, by doing what needed doing, in the order it needed doing, without excessive reflection on the difficulty. What was different now was harder to point to directly. The work was the same work, the house was the same house. Wade still came in at midday with the focused quietness of a man who had been thinking about practical things since dawn, and Jasper still had opinions about coffee, and the Colorado wind still came off the mountain at night with the patience of something that has forever to spend. But the two hooks by the door now had two hats on them. The kitchen table had its two chairs settled into position as permanently as furniture gets, no longer an accommodation, but simply how it was. Wade had moved his accounts to the same ledger Naomi kept, not because she'd asked, but because one Tuesday morning he'd brought his separate record over and set it next to hers and said, "Makes more sense in one place," and she had agreed, and that was the whole of the conversation, but what it meant was not small. What it meant was, I'm not managing this separately from you anymore. The things that were hard, she didn't romanticize. There were mornings when Eli was sick again, a winter cold that ran for 10 days in February and left both of them ragged at the edges, short-tempered in ways they didn't mean, and apologized for imperfectly. There was a week in March when two of the cattle got into a section of fence that hadn't been properly repaired after the October storm, and the damage to the herd was minor, but the argument about whose oversight had missed it was not, and they said things that were true but not quite fair, and then sat through a very quiet supper and came back to it 2 days later and worked through it with the difficulty that all true things take when they involve more than one person's accountability. She had not expected the arguments. Or rather, she had expected them in theory, but not in their particular form. Wade's arguments were not loud, which was somehow harder to navigate than loud would have been. He went quiet in a way that had texture to it, a specific contained quality that she had to learn to read rather than react to. And her own responses when she was frustrated had a briskness that he told her once, carefully, felt like being dismissed. She'd sat with that. She hadn't liked it, but she'd sat with it, and then she'd changed. That was the thing nobody told you about choosing someone she was coming to understand. You didn't just choose the version of them that sat across the lamp in December and said the right thing. You chose the full complicated machinery of them, and they chose yours. And the ongoing work of that was not like the stories made it sound. It was smaller and more repetitive and also somehow more than the stories suggested. Because what built between people who actually tried was not a single dramatic thing, but 10,000 small decided things, and each one was a choice, and you had to keep making it. She kept making it. So did he. Spring arrived late, the way Colorado springs do, announcing themselves and then retreating, and then returning in earnest sometime in April when you'd half stopped expecting it. Eli, 14 months old, was in the full furious mobility of a toddler who had decided that the world existed primarily as a series of things to climb, and the ranch presented him with abundant opportunity. He had developed opinions, strong ones, and early, which Jasper said was inevitable, given the parentage, and which Wade received as a fact about his son, with the slightly helpless expression of a man who recognizes his own stubbornness in a new form. His son. That was still a thing that arrived freshly each time, the phrase. Wade Holloway had not expected to be anyone's father. He had, at some point before Naomi arrived, and in the aftermath of whatever had happened in Missouri that he still did not talk about and she did not push, made a private decision that the particular risk of loving something small and dependent was not one he was built to take. He had arranged his life accordingly. The single chair, the two hooks with only one in use, the fence lines that were always precisely maintained because precise maintenance of external things was one way to manage the interior ones. And then an infant had grabbed his boot and looked up at his face and smiled, and the arrangement had begun to fail from that exact moment without Wade being fully aware of it until much later. He talked to Eli the way he talked to most things he was trying to understand, steadily, without performance, asking questions the boy couldn't yet answer, as though the conversation would eventually catch up to itself. Naomi would come around the side of the barn and find them in the yard, Wade crouched down to toddler height, examining something on the ground. A rock, an insect, a particular configuration of mud that had caught Eli's attention, and narrating it with the same serious care he brought to cattle conditions and fence assessments. "That's a beetle," she heard him say once. "He's going somewhere. Probably knows where." Animals generally do. Eli crouched lower to look at it, nearly fell, caught himself on Wade's knee without looking up. "You've got his attention," Naomi said. "He's got mine," Wade said, and it was entirely true, and he said it without any of the hedging that used to surround things he meant. The letter from Margaret came in May, 6 months after the wedding. It was longer than Margaret's letters usually were, which meant she had felt something strongly enough to override her natural economy with words. She wrote about Thomas, which she rarely did directly. She wrote about what he had been like as a boy, stubborn and quick and devoted to things he decided to care about, with a completeness that sometimes ran ahead of his judgment. She wrote that she thought Eli had something of that in him, the way he went at things with his whole self. She wrote that she hoped the ranch was well, and that Wade's cattle were profitable, and that Naomi was writing in the account books in good ink and not that pale stuff she'd used back in Cincinnati that faded. At the end of the letter, in the last paragraph, she wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said, that obligations can be chosen as well as inherited. I think you were right. I don't think I knew that before, or if I did, I hadn't let it inconvenience me sufficiently. Arthur says I am becoming philosophical in my old age. I told him I prefer to think of it as correcting course. Give Eli my love. Give the rest of it to yourself." Naomi read the letter twice and then read it to Wade at the table that evening, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your sister-in-law is a better writer than she wants to let on." "She is," Naomi agreed. "She thinks clarity is a vulnerability." "Does she?" "She's revising that position, I think." Wade turned his coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking something through. "We should go back east," he said, "before Eli's too old to travel easily. Let her see him properly." Naomi looked at him. Going back east had not been a thing she'd considered in any concrete way. She had left that life with the conviction, even if she hadn't fully articulated it, that leaving was permanent. The fact that Wade was the one proposing to return was not a small thing. It meant he understood that her past was not something to be sealed off, but something to be integrated, and that he was willing to be part of that integration. "Next fall, maybe," she said, "when the herd settled." "Next fall," he agreed. She wrote back to Margaret that night. She wrote about Eli and the beetle and what Wade had said about animals knowing where they're going. She wrote about the ranch in spring, the way the country opened up after winter in a way that still surprised her even after a full year of watching it. She wrote, at the end, "You were right in the letter you wrote me after the funeral, the one where you said you didn't know what I was going to do. Neither did I. It turns out the not knowing was the necessary part. You can't find the right thing if you've already decided what it looks like." She sealed the letter and put it on the shelf by the door to go out with the next mail, and went back to the kitchen where Eli was awake past his bedtime for reasons that seemed sufficient to him, and that Wade was managing with the patience of a man who had learned that certain negotiations with toddlers are conducted on the toddler's terms, regardless of the adult's preference. "Bed," Wade said, for the third time, without particular conviction. Eli said no, with the cheerful finality of someone who considers the subject closed. "He gets that from you," Wade said to Naomi. "He absolutely does not," she said, and picked up her son and took him to bed, where he was asleep in 4 minutes in the way that children are, completely, instantly, with a lack of transition that adults have permanently lost access to. She stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at him for a moment. Then she went back out to the kitchen. It was a year, almost exactly, from the day she'd arrived in Colton on the stagecoach with $12 in her boot and a baby on her hip and a dead man's name on a letter of introduction. She had not been counting the days. She was not a woman who counted days as a habit. But the anniversary of it arrived in April with enough clarity that she recognized it when it came. She was standing on the porch in the early morning, before Wade was up, before Eli was awake, in the 20 minutes that were hers alone before the day assembled itself into everything it needed to be. The valley was coming into color the way it did in spring, not all at once, but as a series of small decisions made by the land without consulting anyone. The mountains to the west still held their winter white, but the lower ground was greening, and the creek she could just hear from the porch had the higher, faster sound of snowmelt running through it with purpose. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach a year ago. She had not liked that woman much at the time. This was something she could admit now that she couldn't have admitted then. She had been too frightened to be likable, to herself or anyone else, too tightly held, too relentlessly functional, managing every feeling as a practical matter to be contained rather than a thing to be experienced. She had been so busy not falling apart that she had not allowed herself to register any of it. Not the grief for Thomas, not the anger at circumstances, not the loneliness that had started long before she arrived in Colorado and would have accompanied her anywhere she went until she dealt with it honestly. What the frontier had done to her. What Wade Holloway and a storm and a fever and a baby learning to walk and a neighbor with good judgment and an old man with opinions about coffee had collectively done was dismantle that particular structure. Not all at once. Over a year of small daily pressures, the way water works on stone. And what was underneath wasn't the wreckage she'd been afraid of. It was just her. Imperfect and particular and more capable than she'd given herself credit for, but also more in need of people than she'd permitted herself to admit. She had needed to need people. That was the thing she'd been most frightened of, and the thing that had saved her. There is a version of strength that is really just refusal. Refusal to depend, refusal to ask, refusal to let the walls down even when what's outside the walls is not a threat, but a life. She had been practicing that version for years, and it had kept her upright, and it had cost her more than she'd known. The strength that had actually gotten her through this year was different. It was the kind that could accept help from a man who offered a second chair at his table, the kind that could say, "I love you" across a kitchen table without certainty of what came back, the kind that let a baby be held by someone who had not been asked and did not need to be. That kind of strength had to be built. It didn't arrive intact, and you couldn't build it alone. The door behind her opened, and Wade came out with 2 cups of coffee, which he did sometimes in the mornings when he woke early, because in the 9 months since they'd been married, he had learned that this was one of the things she valued without knowing she valued it. He handed her a cup and stood beside her on the porch, and looked out at the same valley and said nothing, which was the other thing she valued. After a while, she said, "It's been a year." "Since you arrived?" "Yesterday, give or take a few days. I came in on a Tuesday." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountain. "Jasper told me about you," he said, "before you came out to the ranch. He rode into town the morning after you arrived, and he told me there was a woman at the depot who'd come all the way from Ohio, and her man was dead, and she had a baby, and she was sitting outside on her suitcase in the street, and she hadn't cried." Naomi looked at him. "Jasper said that?" He said, what he actually said was, "There's a woman in town with more nerve than sense, and she's going to need somewhere to land, and if you don't offer it, somebody worse will." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That was his argument for me hiring you." "More nerve than sense," Naomi repeated. "I thought it was probably accurate," Wade said. "It is, incidentally. Still." She almost laughed. "That is genuinely the most romantic thing you've said to me. I mean it affectionately. I know you do." She looked back at the valley. "He's good, Jasper." "He is. He's been trying to fix my life for 8 years and mostly failing, and this time he didn't. He'd say he had very little to do with it." "He'd be wrong," Wade said, and drank his coffee. The morning light was working its way into the valley, filling in the color by degrees, and somewhere in the barn, the horses were starting their morning routine of impatience, and from inside the house came the first sounds of Eli waking up. That specific pre-cry sound of a toddler registering consciousness and deciding how he felt about it. "I'll get him," Wade said, and went inside. Naomi stood on the porch with her coffee and listened to the sounds of her husband talking to her son through the wall of the house, the low, even voice that Eli had been listening to since he was 8 months old and which had become, somewhere in the accumulation of daily things, the sound that meant safe to him. And she thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. Not just geographically, not just the stagecoach and the road and the coordinates, the other kind of arriving, the one that takes longer and requires more losses and more choices and more mornings on more porches before you recognize it as arrival at all.
She had come 2,000 miles, and she had lost her plan before she'd been in town an hour, and she had made a choice every single day since. To stay or to go, to ask or not ask, to say the thing or hold it back, to let someone in or keep the walls exactly where she'd built them. Some of those choices had been wrong. She had made mistakes in this house, and she would make more. Wade would too. Eli would grow up in a family that was imperfect in its own specific ways, shaped by loss and survival, and two people who had chosen each other carefully and with difficulty and would keep choosing because that was what you did. But she was here. She had arrived.
Not at the life she'd planned, which was gone, but at the one she'd actually built, which was better than the plan had been because it was real, and she knew every flaw in it, and she had chosen it anyway. The voice inside the house had changed tone. Wade was saying something about breakfast that Eli apparently found funny, given the sound that followed, the particular toddler laugh that had no complexity in it whatsoever, pure and simple, and loud as a bell. Naomi finished her coffee. She turned and went inside to where her family was, and the door closed behind her, and the valley kept its mourning, and the mountains held their white for a few more weeks before they too let go of winter and moved into what came next. What comes next is never the thing you planned for. That is the thing she would have told the woman sitting on a suitcase in the street in the spring of 1875. That the plan falling apart is not the disaster. The disaster is deciding the plan was all there was. The woman on the suitcase was already braver than she knew and already carrying, without realizing it, every capacity she would need. She just needed the year. She needed the hard particular year of it, the fever and the flood and the arguments and the tin cups and the second chair, and the man who rode 40 miles in December without explaining why and came back with a ring that fit. She needed to find out that strength isn't the same as self-sufficiency, that love isn't the same as safety, that home is not a place you arrive at, but a thing you build, one decided day at a time, with people who are also building, also imperfect, also afraid, and choosing anyway. The door closed. Inside, Eli Holloway climbed his father's leg and demanded breakfast, and his mother put the coffee pot on, and the ranch held all of them in the quiet Colorado morning, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was in all its ordinary imperfect dailiness, everything.